I want to show you how you can take your HX Stomp from sounding like this to sounding like this. And as a perk, you can also download this exact preset on my website. Check out the link in the description. It is free, but if you want to learn how to make your own presets, dial things in with Snapshots, stick around because I think you'll really like this video. So let's get started. So this video is going to assume that you've got a pretty basic understanding of your HX Stomp and how to navigate through it. If you don't, no problem. I've got a ton of other HX Stomp videos on my channel, so be sure to subscribe. But first and foremost, when diving into our preset, we're gonna wanna start with the amp and the cab option. And since this is praise and worship, we're gonna go with your typical Vox AC30 style sound. And if you're not using the impulse response option, this is where you would have amp and then IR, but just to save ourselves an extra block, this is where we can pair it together. But then what we'll wanna do is start to adjust the individual parameters with our amp. I typically recommend pull the drive way back to, anywhere between 4 to 4.5. The bass, we're gonna pull back as well. The cut, we are also gonna pull back to around 5. The treble, we're gonna boost to around 6, and then our presence, we're gonna up as well. And what this does is it's going to give us something that's a cleaner bass signal to work with, and then we'll stack on overdrive and effects to color our sound later on. Now for the channel volume, we can bump this up as well. And then everything else, sag, hum, you can adjust to your preference, but I personally don't adjust or do anything with. And then we can move on over to our 212 Silver Bell. I think this is perfect in terms of our cabinet. If you did want to change that, you can do so over here on the left, but we'll go ahead, we'll change it to a 57 dynamic mic. We will move the position a little bit closer towards the center of the cabinet, and this is going to give us a little bit more presence and treble. Everything else I think is fine exactly where it is. Now the next step from here is where we'll go in and start to add all of our effects before our actual signal chain. So in this case, because it's praise and worship, we are going to compress the heck out of our signal chain. I typically recommend the deluxe comp or the kinky comp. In this case, we will use the deluxe comp. And then for our threshold, we are going to start to squash everything around that minus 40 decibel range. I typically prefer more compression, so around 6.1 or 4.1. For the attack, we're gonna drop that to around 90 milliseconds. And then for the release, we're gonna pull that up to around 600 as well. For the mix, we can crank that back just so we have some of our natural signal chain coming through. And then for the level, the knee, honestly, it's probably fine where it is. If you want to add a little bit more boost towards your signal, you can here, but just know it's going to raise the overall ground floor of your signal chain. And then we can go in and we can adjust that level here. Now, the next step is adding somewhat of a transparent overdrive. In this case, the Minotaur overdrive from line 6 is going to be very similar to a KLON style pedal. And I typically create this in such a way that it's an always on pedal. So I will pull the drive or the gain way back to around 1.2. The tone, we can actually crank just a little bit and give us a little more level as well. Now I will show you later on in this video where we will be able to go in and adjust parameters within our individual effects blocks just by simply switching to a different snapshot. But for now, we'll just leave this exactly how it is. From here, I will typically go in and add a couple of effects such as chorus, trem, some sort of vibrato style pedal, just because it's going to help create some different effects that we can use, especially in like a verse 2 of a song or during the initial chorus. In terms of some of my favorite tremolo, this is where I go with the optical trem. I'll switch it so we are in an 8th note. For the intensity, you can control this to your individual taste. I do typically add a little bit of a boost though, because there's going to be a perceived volume drop because tremolo is going to take your signal and cut it in and out. And then from here, we'll go in, and if we wanted to, we could always add a chorus or some other pedal in here. For this preset, we're not gonna do that today. One other thing that I would recommend though is adding more of a stacked on kind of overdrive, and that way we've got our bass signal chain, and when we get to bigger sections of the song, then we can crank on another overdrive. In this case, this is where I would recommend using the Heir Apparent, which is gonna be the Prince of Tone overdrive. In this case, this is where we can go in and we can pull the gain back just a little if we want. The tone we can pull back as well because this is a pretty saturated pedal. And then for the presence, this is where we can bump it just a little. For the clipping option, I typically would do the overdrive or the distortion. The gain mod, we can leave it higher, level. And then if you want more overall headroom, this is where you can change the voltage from 9 volts to 18 volts. We'll change it to 18 just so we've got a little bit more space here. Now the next piece of this is gonna be dialing in some of our wet effects. And this is entirely personal preference. I normally set it up where I've got my wet effects coming after my amp. A lot of people like their wet effects before their amp. And really the pros and the cons between the two is if you have your wet effects after your amp, that means you're gonna get more of a natural sound from your guitar and your amp. Your wet effects are really largely going to complement your bass signal chain versus if you have your wet effects before your amp, you're going to notice those coloring your amp tone a lot more. Now for worship, a lot of times people prefer having their wet effects before their amp because it's going to allow them to get a more ambient and saturated wet tone versus having it afterwards. In this case, again, you can do whichever you prefer. I typically prefer feeling like I have a really good amp tone and kind of bass tone and then complementing that with the wet effects. Now this is where I recommend we go in and start with our delay, switch it on over to stereo because who doesn't love stereo delays? And we'll go ahead and select the dual delay option. And then in this case, we'll switch one where we've got that eighth sound and then one with a dotted eighth. You could also set this up where the left or the right side is gonna be a quarter note and then dotted eighth. Entirely depends on what you like, but the eighth and dotted eighth sound is that typical kind of U2 vibe. For our feedback, this is where we can tend to accentuate our left or right side, depending on what we want to do. In this case, I'm gonna bump the left feedback and the right feedback just a little bit more. Gives us more repeats. And then for our mix, I'm actually gonna pull back the dotted eighth one just to make it a little more balanced over here. And for our level, we can keep right about where it is. For the low cut, I do typically recommend adding a low cut around 60 to 80 hertz. This is gonna help remove some of the muddiness and what's repeating after your signal chain. For our high cut, this is where we can go in and start to remove those higher frequencies. Really anything around 10 to 12K is fine. Then from here, you can choose if you want to add some modulation, chorus, vibrato. In this case, we'll just turn it off because sometimes I feel like it's just a little annoying if it's too prominent in the mix to have that repeat, have some modulation that you don't have on your bass signal chain. And then for speed, depth, spread, this is for our effects here. And then for the trails, this is where I recommend we're gonna head and turn that on. And then that way when we get to our snapshots, that is what's going to allow us to make sure we have those repeats and easy spillover between all of these. Now the next and final piece to all of that is we are going to want to add our reverb. In this case, this is where I just typically like a dynamic hall reverb. I think this is perfect. It gives us everything we need in that worship setting. And then, like I said earlier, I will talk through how we can adjust individual parameters within our delay and different effects when we switch to our snapshots as well. From here, we'll pull the decay back to around 3 to 3.2. Our pre-delay, we will bump all the way up here, way up to around 120, 130. For our room size, we can keep it around 20 meters. For diffusion, I typically pull this all the way up to 100. For our damping, we're gonna pull this all the way up to here, up to 18K as well. For our mix, we can pull this back just a little bit so it's not too prominent in our kind of, clean signal. I like to have quite a bit of motion here since we're pulling it back, so we can pull that up to around 6. For our low frequency, we'll pull this back, bump our low cut to around 300. No need to adjust gain here. And then for our high cut, we can bump this up to around 7,000. Again, don't need to adjust our level, and then we'll turn those trails on. Now be sure to go in and save that preset, because if you don't and you bounce to somewhere else here in HX Edit, you will just have lost everything we did. From there, this gives us a really awesome starting place just so we can hear quickly what that kind of sounds like. Again, gives us a good starting point. Now let's talk about how we can go in and adjust these with snapshots, assign different effects blocks with the actual controller as well, and really everything else you need to know. And again, if you're enjoying this video, be sure to subscribe. Lets me know what content people enjoy, and then I can make more of it in the future for you all. Now, this next section is crucial, and in my opinion, if you want to take full advantage of the HX Stomp, you should definitely consider getting some sort of external controller like the Helixi Mini from Pedalnetics. Rocksock has a cheap $30 TRS option, or Jet has their Micro, which is a MIDI controller. And all this is going to do is really just help solve the problem of you only have 3 foot switches on the HX Stomp. And so in this case, if we just add an external controller, we can have a 4th, 5th, or even 6th foot switch to be able to map things with our HX Stomp. Now I'll have a more detailed video comparing some of these options here in the future. I use the Helixi Mini Pro from Pedalnetics. I absolutely love it. It is perfect. It doesn't take up any extra real estate on your pedal board. But in this case, what it gives me the ability to do is actually go in to my HX Stomp and map using the bypass and control setting here to a different foot switch. So in this case, I can map things to my 4th, 5th foot switch with that external controller. So from here, let's go in and start with our KLON Overdrive, go to bypass and add it to our first foot switch here. For the type, latching is perfect. Everything else we could leave the same way it is. If you, for instance, wanted to rename this to like KLON, or change the color, you could do that as well. For our trem, we're gonna go to bypass again, add that to foot switch number 3. And again, this is where you're gonna be really limited. If you don't have a 4th, 5th foot switch, you're not gonna be able to assign a 3rd foot switch here because by default, it's set to your tap and tempo. But in this case, I can go in and I can assign it to the 3rd foot switch, go here, make it to my 4th, 5th, and so forth, which again gives us a ton of options. If, for instance, we wanted to go in and let's say I only wanted to engage an effect momentarily, such as a pitch shift or a trem or a chorus pedal, this is where I could go in and I could change that to momentary. And what that means is when I hold down the pedal, it will engage, but when I let go, it will slowly roll back. So that can be a really cool effect, especially like I said, if you're using something like an octave pedal. Just gives you some cool flexibility with the HX Stomp. So now let's talk about snapshots, which I think is absolutely crucial. And this is what's really gonna take you from like having a base knowledge of the HX Stomp to just being next level. And you're gonna be able to do a lot with this. So let's talk about it. So to go to the original patch, which you can download on my website, the way I've got it set up here is we've got our home base, we've got a trem, snapshot, and then ambient. And the way it's set up here is you can see that under bypass and controller assign, I've actually got it so that when I switch to, let's say, my delay and go from my home base to my ambient, it will automatically adjust my feedback. I could adjust my level, I could adjust mix. I can also do this on my reverb as well and adjust the mix. I can do this with gain settings, my amp settings, etc. And the reason this is so great is because now with the switch of one button, I can all of a sudden adjust 3 or 4 different effects blocks all at once. I can change multiple parameters within those effects. I can go from a really clean sound to something crazy washed out, super overdriven, however you want to set this up. So in this case, what we have to do is we go to our bypass controller assign. Now, all we have to do if we want to be able to control this is go to our bypass controller assign. Right here where it says dual delay, we'll switch from bypass to choosing the parameter we want to adjust with our snapshot. So let's say we want to do our left and our right mix. We simply click on that, and where it says controller, this is where we can go in and we can click on snapshots. We'll want to do the same thing for right mix. And now when we go back to edit, what you will notice is there's this option here for left mix and right mix. Now what I can do is I have my base snapshot here, but let's say when I switch to snapshot 2, I want my mix to be substantially higher. Now I can go in and I can set that up here. So when I switch from snapshot 1 to snapshot 2, it will automatically adjust my mix. And we can do this across a lot of different pedals. We can do this with our overdrive. I can go in and choose to add more gain or add more reverb, decay, mix, etc. all just by switching to different snapshots. And I'm not gonna spend a ton of time diving into all of the nit and gritty of like what you would actually do to adjust your snapshots, but hopefully that gives you kind of a base idea so you can really be creative. You can even do that with different amp effects as well. So if you theoretically want to add more cut, presence, volume, drive for your amp block, if you want to adjust, your compression, really any of your effects, this is where you can go to that bypass. You can choose what parameter you want to edit, and then you can go in and add it to the snapshot and change it from there. And if you've got questions, be sure let me know in the comments below, or check out my website. You've got the 65 amps for free. You can download it for the HX Stomp, the Helix, or the LT. But hopefully that gives you guys really an awesome starting point to have something that sounds fantastic for your HX Stomp and is truly kind of an all-in-one option. Now, if you got more questions on how I've set up my pedal board, watch this video right here, and I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.